All right, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's discussion, where we're going to focus on CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Requirements that will soon apply to anyone in the US DoD supply chain or anyone who wants to be. I'd like to thank our partners at Allergen who are facilitating the session. We'll speak a little bit later about how we've partnered with them to deliver services. I'd also like to thank the BrightTalk folks and their entire network for helping us what we believe is a pretty critical message to businesses in this space. We're going to hit some highlights today in a few key areas. We're going to talk about what is CMMC. We're going to hit on who has to comply, what are the certification levels, how do you get certified, and how is CMMC different than DFARS? If you've already worked in this space, you'll be familiar with some of those acronyms. We'll get into that too. And at the end, we'll open the floor for some Q&A, but feel free to send in your questions as we go through the content. We'll address them at the end. Before we kick off, a few intros. My name is Jeff Roberts. After almost 20 years in aerospace and defense IT exec roles, managing, directing IT for business units, divisions, regions, and entire sectors of a global multi-billion-dollar enterprise, I co-founded Principia Raid to focus on providing strategic advisory and consulting to bring that experience to bear where needed. With years as VP of IT roles, managing things like IT governance, information security, compliance and assurance projects and programs across a variety of business units with multiple cybersecurity frameworks and regulatory compliance requirements like, SSA, NIST, ISO 27001, DFARS, CMMC now, ITAR export control. I'm the CIO and strategy head on the Principia Raid team with some previous depth in everything from mergers and acquisitions, divestments, integrations, P&L, audit, due diligence, risk management, disaster recovery, all the buzzwords, right? Been there, done that a little bit. So Principia Raid was founded primarily to focus on these relevant business areas and to deliver services to companies at a higher value and lower cost than your typical CIO or CISO or full-time exec position. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Craig. He can do his intro and then we'll pick up into the content.
Good day, everyone. My name is Craig Philippe. As Jeff just said, the CMMC is becoming critical to anyone that wants to do business with the DoD and in the future, maybe even beyond that. And we'll talk a bit about that. And as a result, it seems like Jeff and I are talking, at least every other day about the CMC and what it means to companies. A little bit about my background before we start. I came from a background of engineering and law. I retired after 20 years of working cyber as an FBI special agent, and I went to work for a multi-billion, multinational aerospace defense manufacturer. I was the CISO there and dealt with the security and compliance of multiple sub-business units. When that company was acquired, it was a great time to set off on our own, and Jeff and I co-founded Principia Raid. We essentially offer, as Jeff said, virtual CISO and security and compliance advisory services. So let's get to talking about it. Why is CMC important? Who has to worry about CMMC and what it means to everyone that has been dealing with the DFARS up to this point, and what it means if you haven't been. So Jeff, back to you.
Thanks, Craig. Let's start with a little bit of background and history. We'll get into the what is CMMC, but it's important to kind of understand the context and where it comes from. So many of you may already be familiar with the NIST 800-171. That refers to the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-171, which governs controlled unclassified information in non-federal information systems and organizations. So it's essentially a list of standards that define how to safeguard and distribute material deemed sensitive, but not necessarily classified. The NIST really built on the information security triad. That's pretty common speak in the InfoSec circles, where you're concerned about the availability of data, the integrity of data, the confidentiality of data. The NIST takes that concept and adds a fourth topic. It adds safety because you're obviously concerned about how to manage the embedded technology risk in being the gatekeepers and potential protectors of that type of data. The NIST, the 800-171, was developed after the Federal Information Security Management Act was passed in 2003. It really created in part to improve cybersecurity, especially after many well-documented breaches. But according to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they really see this as a national imperative to make sure that unclassified information that isn't part of federal information systems and organizations is properly protected and consistent. And that gets us into DFARS a little bit. So for certain government agencies, most notably the DoD, Department of Defense, the GSA, General Services Administration, and NASA, a revised set of rules for NIST compliances took effect December 31st, 2017, requiring anybody who works with CUI from those agencies to implement pretty specific security measures for how you handle data and for how you report non-compliance. And under this set of federal regulations, the DFARS clause, every affected company and agency is required to assess and document their compliance in handling this info in more than a dozen areas and categories, from the way your network's configured to the way any and all sensitive data is protected, even to the way that employees might receive access to that data. Prior to these requirements, every agency had a somewhat unique set of rules for data handling, for safeguarding, and even disposal of this material. And these inconsistent standards posed a pretty big challenge and a significant enough security concern when information needed to be shared, especially across multiple contractors. So the creation of the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, is really a tiered approach to how the government is going to measure contractor compliance with the NIST 800-171. And CMMC introduces a set of 5 levels of maturity expectations, and the level that you will be required to meet will vary according to your actual contract and according to which government agency that contract might be with. So the big thing to remember is the NIST and the DFARS evolving into CMMC, and really CMMC being created to address a couple of pretty serious problems. Multiple breaches in the last couple of years, and very low rates of self-reported contractor compliance against those standards. It's really that systemic non-compliance by both primes and by their subs that have driven the need for third-party audit, proving existence and evidence of CMMC compliance at the necessary level. We'll get into it in a little bit, but that's one of the big deltas, is self-assessment turning into required and mandated assessments by third parties. I'm going to hand it over to Craig to talk a little bit about who has to comply and why you need to care about this.
Speaking about who needs to worry about CMMC, right? Who's going to be implicated in this? Jeff just spoke a little bit about it. The CMC is specific to the DoD. What we're talking about today is anybody who wants to do business with the DoD, anybody who wants to do business with a business doing business with the DoD, and right down the line, right? Anyone that's wrestled with NIST is familiar with the struggle to bring your supply chain into compliance as well. Well, CMMC is going to force you to do that, right? You've got to watch your supply chain. That's what the government's doing here, right? Any security practitioner over the last few years is familiar that third-party breach is really the preferred avenue of ingress to bad actors, right? So this is in part an answer to that, right? And as Jeff said, it's also in part to fairly cavalier response to the DFARS and the self-assessment as well. So the level that you'll be responsible for when you're bidding on a contract will be specified in the RFP and the RFI. So you don't have to imagine it, or you don't have to reason it out. It's going to be specifically in there, and the different levels as to what relate directly to what kind of service your company will be providing. So let's just go through the levels at its most basic. The first, level 1, refers to companies that indirectly influence the cybersecurity or the CUI environment, right? So what they're talking here, some of the examples they give are landscapers, bookkeepers, HR recruiters, people that might indirectly have access, maybe a password login. They certainly wouldn't have fulsome access to your whole system. Those are level 1. and we'll go over what that means to those people. If you find yourself in that category, what kind of levels and cybersecurity posture you need to find yourself in order to bid on these contracts. Level 2 is you directly influence the CUI environment, but you don't control the CUI. Good example of that is cybersecurity consultants, right? They're informing on the infrastructure and the actual systems that will handle the CUI, but they don't actually go in. They're not doing the engineering design. They're not doing the keeping, the documents, the maintenance of the documents. Then we get to level 3, and here's where the rubber really meets the road, right? You have these are companies that are storing and processing and transmitting CUI. You get up to that point, you're talking regular government contractors, and to get to level 4 and 5, you're talking about advanced technologies, for instance, munitions, weapon systems, and nuclear services to the government. You're going to be up in level 4 and 5 in that if you're providing those services. The government's still, the CMMC process is still being developed somewhat for 4 and 5, but we definitely know what to expect for 3. And that is at a minimum where you'll be if you're designing and you're managing and you have CUI in your control. Let's talk a bit about the certification levels themselves and what it means if you find yourself level 1 and find yourself in level 5, right? If you want to bid on those contracts. The CMMC maturity program goes in 2 tracks. Tracks 2 real processes and practices. It tracks whether you're actually doing certain controls, whether you've enacted certain controls, and the processes behind them, the maturity of your company. It goes from performing at the lowest level to documenting as the next step up to managing and then reviewing the processes and the practices and then optimizing. I would recommend don't get too wrapped up in whether, well, are we optimizing or are we simply reviewing? That's a little bit like looking at the wrong end of the telescope. What you really have to worry about is whether you meet the controls of the particular level you're in. If you meet the controls, then you can just say, hey, I'm at level 4, I'm reviewing. You can identify where you are. Some people will say that the CMMC is, they'll call it things like a journey. It's not necessarily a compliance regime. It's supposed to generate a mature and very complete cybersecurity state in your company, but I will tell you, and I recommend, right, there's certain controls you have to abide by. So it really is simply going through and making sure you're doing the required controls. Let's go down the 5 levels and kind of what they're involved in terms of controls. The level 1, again, this is the basic, you're indirectly influencing CUI. That is basic safeguarding, right? You have 17 controls. It's essentially just the basic DFARS clause in the contract. Again, these are things like landscapers, folk that may have an email account, things just very basic cyber hygiene. Level 2 is the transitioning level from basic to actually managing CUI. There are some of the NIST controls at that point, and there are 7 intermediate cybersecurity hygiene controls, and then we get to level 3 where again, this is the real meat of the matter. If you're handling CUI, you've got to be level 3. For CMMC, you've got to actually meet all of the NIST 800-171 controls, and they have thrown in 20 CMMC controls, which they call good hygiene controls. Level 4 and 5, again, these are more advanced. You're getting into a proactive state with level 4. It adds 11 of the Rev B 171 controls and 15 proactive controls, and we'll talk a little bit about those, but those are things at level 4, you're getting into automated asset management, things that you were probably doing by hand before. You're controlling the flow of domains aggressively, of information between domains aggressively. And then we get up to level 5, and that is advanced cybersecurity and APT, risk reduction, and you start talking a lot about standardizing and optimizing. And you get a lot into processes, but there are still some technical additions. Even at level 5, you're now analyzing all the scripts that are being run. You're monitoring for anomalies. These are things you may have already found yourself doing just to bootstrap yourself up to level 3, but at level 5, they're actually required. I just wanted to show here kind of how many again, I just went over the controls, but these are the level of controls, the number of controls per level. You can see that each level builds upon the previous level. If you're at level 3, then we know you've already made level 1 and you've already complied with level 2, and so on all the way up to 5, and each one just kind of adding a bit of control here and there. And what we wanted to show on this slide is when you look at this, you know, level 5, 171 controls. That's a lot. That's a lot to manage. Keeping track of the evidence repository for that is a heavy lift as well. Level 2, you might get away with just using a spreadsheet to track it. If you're at level 3, what we recommend when we go out and do assessments is engaging some type of tracking and compliance solution. So what I wanted to show in this slide is when you get up above, when you're trying to manage the evidence and the compliance state of 130 controls, you can't really use the Excel spreadsheet anymore, and it becomes something where you actually need a specific solution for it. And there's some great ones out there as well. So just something to be aware of when you're actually tracking that number of controls. You'll from experience, you'll want something that helps you manage it rather than just that clicking open that spreadsheet and trying to use the pivot tables on their own. We're showing the CMMC domains here. So I wanted to show a little bit, we're going to get a little bit into the difference between the NIST controls, the new domains that CMMC is putting in there. And again, CMMC tracks NIST 171 pretty directly, but it did add 3 new domains, and you may find yourself already having done these things, but it does bear mentioning, right? So the CMMC added asset management, situational awareness, and recovery as 3 new domains. And again, some of the controls within there, you're going to say to yourself, hey, I was already doing that, man. Asset management, I was already doing that as a byproduct of having to meet some of the other controls, but you do need to be aware those are actually new ones that you're going to have to collect the evidence for. You're going to have to show that you're doing, and that's what becomes tricky. And again, the previous slide I mentioned, you'll want something to help you track that. The CMMC controls by level and domain. Some domains you won't touch until you get higher up into level 2 or level 3. Some of them you'll be done at an earlier level. Level 2 is the only controls in personnel security. So once you're past level 2, you won't have any new controls in personnel security. But the level of complexity of controls can vary as you go to higher levels. So I just wanted to go over using one of these domains as an example. So I'll use access control, right? At level 1, very simple controls, limit to authorized users, right? You have an email password, very basic. Level 2, you start to see notices required, right? Both security and privacy. And you start to have privileged accounts and privileged functions being called out as well. Level 3, you start to get a little more rarefied. You're actually segregating duties. You're limiting the execution of privileged functions even more. Level 4, you're actually specifically restricting remote access based on risk. So you're getting into, again, more process-driven risk management. And then level 5 has slightly more refined risk review processes. For instance, a risk review on specific to wireless is one of the access controls. So it goes from really basic at level 1 all the way up to actually maturation processes in level 5. Let's talk a little bit about how to get certified.
We'll spend a little bit of time on this one because this is where many of the questions we've been getting have come in. This is new. How do I get certified? What does the process look like? And to be clear, that process is actually still being defined. We'll talk about that a little bit. But why this is so important from a how do I get certified perspective also comes back to one of the earlier points that we were talking about, why should I care? The reason people are going to have to care about how they get certified is it is now a larger audience. The CMMC will impact businesses and companies that previously may not have been impacted. The fact that we see level 3 as a likely entry point for most companies that are going to hold and control CUI, one of the reasons behind CMMC has been the number of data breaches in the last number of years. And in many of those examples, the breach didn't come from the prime. It came from one of the subcontractors to the prime that may have had access to the prime's network. So ergo, the bookkeepers, the HR staff, the IT consultants or service providers possibly might only be a level 2 or a level 1, but that's now a whole new ecosystem of companies that are going to need to get themselves certified if they want to continue doing business in the defense supply chain. So how do I get certified is important. It's a larger audience. And the estimate at the moment is we're talking about easily 200,000 to 300,000 organizations. The content we're going to go through here is actually pulled right from the CMMC AB, the accreditation board website. You can go check it out yourself, but we thought it was important enough to talk through a little bit of what it looks like right now. What it looks like right now is important because, again, this is still in flux. As we speak, there have been some recent changes to the board. There's still discussion around what the timelines look like and when certifications are going to be required. But one of the bits that is clearly communicated is that all DoD suppliers will need CMMC certification by 2025. And the suggestion from this, federal agency is if you already know that you need to be certified, you better start thinking about it now. And now is a good time to start getting ready. Their key recommendation is it's at least a 6-month journey from engaging with an approved supplier to actually getting an assessment. Ideally, you can do it inside the 6-month window, but the point is start thinking about it now is the advice. That's important advice for a number of reasons. Obviously, as a certified third-party assessor organization, certification pending, I'm saying pending because at the moment, no one is actually certified to do an official assessment. The process is still being massaged and tweaked, and we expect it may be 3 months out before that's actually sorted. At the moment, Principia Rate is on the list of approved C3PAOs in a pending status. So anybody that you're talking to, just be clear, no one is officially certified to do this yet. But step one, obviously, identify your necessary maturity level. As Craig mentioned before, that should be pretty clear. If you've got a contract, you will know because you will be told what maturity level you need to meet. And if you're bidding on a new contract, well, CMMC certification is a procurement gate. So you will know as you're bidding on the contract what level you need to achieve, and frankly, what level you will need to be assessed at before you get the contract. So step one, engage a professional for guidance and prep. The accreditation board website actually provides a list of business partners that they've approved and are working with. So it's relatively easy to identify potential folks that can help you with this. You can certainly reach out to your friends at Allergen, who we are working with to provide this service. And underneath all of this, the assessment ecosystem is still preparing the process to license training professionals, to certify the assessors that are going to be approved to move forward. It gives everybody a bit of a window to start engaging now and get the help you might need to both understand what you're going to need to do to close any gaps and, frankly, to be ready to actually apply for and pass an assessment. So to be clear, anyone who will be a credentialed assessor is going to have to pass a rigorous background check and go through the approval process. Once those assessors are formally approved and in place, even once you have an assessment performed, that assessment gets certified by the CMMC Accreditation Board to review any assessment with quality auditors before you get your rubber stamp that says, yes, your business has been accredited at level X. Once you make it through that process, you will be provided with a CMMC certificate that's valid for a 3-year term. Let's be clear, they're building an ecosystem here. So this is not simply you hire an assessor, you get a certificate, see you later. This is about the government ensuring that you are not only sufficiently secure to grant the contract, but that there are processes and procedures in place for you to maintain and continue optimizing and continue validating that you remain secure enough for the DoD to do business with. I can't stress enough how the contract flow down is one of the pieces that they're trying to fix. In the last couple of years, with all kinds of businesses having to self-certify that they're complying with the DFARS standards, one of the requirements there was always to also ensure that you're flowing down those requirements to your subcontracts. Clearly, that was not happening appropriately. And most of the data breaches in the last couple of years were traced to not necessarily the prime, and in some cases, not even the sub, but a sub of a sub of a sub, right? Not the guy who's keeping the drawing secure, but his engineer who might have emailed the drawing to a supplier who makes a part for a supplier who makes a part. So this is about closing those gaps and preventing those breaches.
We've spoken a lot about DFARS, and CMMC draws its DNA from the NIST 800-171, and I know a lot of us out there have wrestled. I've been in the trenches with you, wrestling with the DFARS clause and making sure we're compliant with 800-171 for the last couple of years. Right now CMMC is coming down the pike, and you might be wondering, well, what about all that stuff I just did? Does it inform on anything I now have to do? Does it bring any value? Does it keep value? So the good news is that it definitely helps. However, if you were DFARS, if you were compliant with 800-171, that does not mean you are compliant with CMMC. As we've spoken about, CMMC adds some additional controls, but that's not the only thing that's different. The main difference is that you can no longer self-certify. You now need to bring, as Jeff said, you now need to bring in those assessors. And that means no more POAMs, right? So you've got to be ready to go when you're submitting for that contract. Now, it is a contractually driven requirement. So we expect to see, the DoD is saying that the CMMC requirement is going to start showing up in RFPs as early as November. Whether that actually happens or not remains to be seen. But if it does appear in the RFPs and it is a requirement, obviously there's a shortage of assessors at this point. There's no C3PAOs yet. That can be remedied through contractual clauses and contractual allowances. So that's how it appears they're going to build the plane in flight, right, to use a bad metaphor. But to make the requirement before you can actually get certified is obviously difficult, but that doesn't let you off the hook. The contractual allowances will probably specify you need to be engaged in bringing yourself up to compliance. So, and probably the last point in terms of differences between CMMC and DFARS before I actually go in the actual controls are the audit, right? How do we prepare for this eventual assessment, which is what it's called in CMMC, not an audit. It's much friendlier. How do we prepare for those assessments? And it's been hinted by the CMMC AAB board until we're given actual audit procedures, until we see what the educational materials are for the class of assessors. What has been hinted is if you use the NIST 800 audit procedures, the audit guide, you should be in good shape. So we do have good guidance right now on what to do to start to prepare. So as Jeff has said, and hopefully I've implied a number of times, don't wait. You've got to get started now. Let's take a look. Let's just finish up with the actual additional controls that CMMC throws at you. You may find, and it's probably likely, that as a byproduct of some of the procedures and some of the techniques and tools that you've been using in order to be, a mature cybersecurity operation that is compliant with 800-171, you may find that you're doing these just as a byproduct. So some of the things, identify and categorize CUI data. Of course, you had to do that already in some form in order to protect the CUI. You need to know where it is, right? But what you need to do now is actually capture that process and think about how you're going to capture that process. How do you show evidence that you've done that, and where do you keep the evidence? And again, I'll touch back on, you might need a solution that actually helps you track that stuff. But again, what evidentiary artifacts would you use? Well, the audit guide that I mentioned, the NIST 800 audit guide, gives great examples of that already. You can find it there. One of the things that it's asking, that one of the new controls is, and I kind of use this as an example, is review audit logs. Well, certainly you've been doing that, right? But are you reviewing the audit logs as a part of a regular course of business, or are you just doing it when an alert pops up in your SIEM? Do you even have a SIEM, right? So it's the difference between having a fully functional SOC, which is a requirement for level 4, by the way, 24/7 responsive SOC, or do you just have somebody who has a collateral duty for security the quintessential Kevin sitting in a corner. When the alert goes up, he actually looks into what caused the alert. That's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about actually formal processes, actually going in and regularly looking, even if there's not an alert, right? So you have to be more proactive in what you're doing to meet these requirements. But you may find that you're already doing them again. That's the good news. The challenge is, of course, making sure you're capturing it and making sure you can articulate when the assessors show up on day one. You can show your policies, procedures, and evidentiary log and say, hey, here's what we're doing.
I think I'd like to close with just a little bit of a summary around, how can we help? At the moment, until the assessment ecosystem is formalized, and there are actually certified third-party assessors, of which we expect to be one, in the interim, we are providing assessment readiness services. We can help you figure out, are you close? Are you there? What does the gap look like? And how do you close it? We can certainly help with solutions to help manage your compliance programs. And we've partnered with folks like our friends at Allergen, who can actually help close some of the operational gaps if indeed you need to engage a managed service provider. So I think the message is, this sounds scary and it looks complicated, but it doesn't have to be. And we're in a position to engage. Look forward to taking some of your questions for sure. But don't let this be a big scary beast, because it's actually not that terribly complicated, assuming you engage the right partners to help you. And if you're already familiar with DFARS and you're some of the way there, there's certainly some work to be done, but it doesn't have to be terribly painful. I'd certainly like to thank everybody for their time today. And I think at this point, we're going to open the floor to some questions. So let's go. Let's take a look at what people have been asking.
Yeah, I like the split screen here. So thank you, everyone. We're going a little over. It's exciting stuff. We talk about it. We can talk about it at length. So just so you know, Jeff and I will stay here and answer questions as long as they keep coming in. You'll be able to access a recording of this. So if you have to duck out because we went a little over, you'll be able to see it in the link. It'll still be on there. So have a lot of great questions. Jeff, why don't I take the first one? There's actually two that are pretty related to each other. When do I need to be compliant? Great. I like a results-driven crowd, right? That's what you gotta wonder. And the other is, when will the CMMC process be finalized, right? So we've talked a lot about that. And actually, as we were speaking, a news crawl came across that the interagency review of the new DFARS rule that will transition from the old standard, right, 800-171, to the new standard CMMC, just finalized, past interagency review. The next step is the interim rule, and it'll go out for public review. And then Katie Arrington is saying, she's the DoD CISO and over the CMMC program, she is saying that she expects to see that in the contractual clause by the end of this year. When do I need to be compliant? Jeff and I have spoke about this in the last couple of minutes, right? By 2025, this is going to be in full flight. There's no reason to think it won't be. That was the original plan. The government is slightly behind where they were hoping to be, but there's enough time to catch up, and the groundwork has been laid, and they'll be able to catch up. So 2025, I would envision they're still going to meet that deadline as full flight. As Jeff said earlier, 6 months is the recommended time to get compliant. I would suggest that's a little aggressive. If you're starting from zero, it's certainly aggressive. If you're already 800-171 compliant, you might be able to pull it off in 6 months. But the message there is, start now. If that clause starts showing up at the end of the year, it is a contractual requirement. You're going to need that or some type of exemption to bid on it, and that's going to be some exciting times.
And Craig, we think that trends realistically, right? Seeing that clause start to show up at least by the end of this year for some of the higher levels, 3 and up for sure, right?
I would think so, yeah. And as we've talked about, they will prioritize who they check on first, right? they're going to do a very tailored, very targeted approach, right? So if you're really deep, if you're doing munitions, if you're doing weapon systems, if you're doing vehicles, you're going to get the knock on the door sooner than the other folk.
Right. All right. We've got a couple more questions here. I'll take, we've got one asking, what does a typical assessment look like? Good question. The unfortunate answer is it depends, but I can cover the basic. And the real it depends is what level do you need to achieve, but the assessment itself is actually pretty much the same process. So typically an assessment will start with a scoping exercise, can be as simple as a phone call or a WebEx, or you pick a platform. And there's some discussion really around scoping. What level do you think you need to be? Do you already know what level you need to be? Or are you bidding on a contract? Or, so understanding what's the business all about. The typical actual assessment will start with a review of the documentation that you might already have. Do you have an SSP in place? How thoroughly are your policies and procedures documented? And the assessment itself, after review of that collateral, will usually be an engagement with a group of your subject matter experts in different categories: networking, security. Is your team insourced? Do you have your own team? Is it outsourced? It's a bit of a deep dive with those teams to flesh out how close to the necessary practices are you already. And at the end of it, we can help you understand, you would be likely assessed at this level. Here are the gaps that you might need to close, and here's how you might close them. Again, reach out if you have any questions or need some help. And we're certainly happy to provide some of that advice. The ones that we've been through haven't actually been as complicated, I think, as some of the companies have expected, and that's always a good sign. Craig, we've got a couple questions about the C3PAO process. How do you become one? What does the roadmap look like? Do you want to take that?
Sure. And then the question actually lays it out pretty well, right? Thanks. And I'll just kind of summarize the question. So they're asking what the actual process of getting the assessment is, right? So, or being an assessor rather. So the question lays out, right? Is the flow actually, you apply to be a C3PAO at level 3, which is as high as they're actually, as the CMMC AB board is actually accrediting now. And then the consultants of that C3PAO organization apply to be level 3 certified assessors. They're then assessed and certified. The assessors are actually checked out, and then they go out and actually certify if a company is at level 3. And then that's, it's just that simple. If you have additional questions, you can always reach out to us. But there is the CMMC AB webpage, which shows all that flow there. And actually, follow up one of the questions: how do we become a pending C3PAO? That is through the CMMC AB website. You go in there, and it's going to require a little bit of prep. You're going to have to be a actual formal organization. You'll have to do some homework, get your DUNS number, get an actual bank account, all that good stuff, and you apply for it right on that website.
Yeah, there's the typical, background checks, proof of insurance. There's a set of requirements that have to be met, but at this point, there is still a host that's in the to be determined category. They've recently pushed through the first cohort in the training session, and feedback from that is just starting to come out now. So again, this is very much in flux, but certainly something that we can help with if you have some further questions. Got another one asking about the solutions. What kind of solutions are available to manage compliance programs? That's actually a really good question. I think both Craig and I have experience in businesses with 0 solutions and measuring everything with painful Excel spreadsheets, which, don't get me wrong, depending on the maturity level of the business, can be a completely appropriate solution. But once you get up to a certain level, especially in the past couple of years, where you've now regularly got customers and the primes, if you happen to be a sub, asking for validation of your program, it's one thing to have your spreadsheet showing here's your compliance statement, but it's another thing to have to respond to customer questionnaires 5 times a month that are getting more and more and more complicated to not just say you're compliant, but to prove it. How are you compliant? How are you tracking your artifacts? So the good news is this ecosystem as well has really matured, even just in the last 6 months to 2 years. And there are certainly a couple of solutions that we prefer, but there's a whole host of options that will actually allow you to manage your compliance program in a way that effectively imports all of the regs. Imagine a SharePoint-y type like tool that will outline all the regulations. You pick your framework. Is it DFARS? Which version of NIST is it? Are you tracking to Rev 1 or Rev B? It will map all of the requirements and then allow you to track your progress individually against each requirement with a 0 to 5 maturity curve, depending on how well you're doing each one, and a repository to measure your artifacts and spit out a set of reports for those instances where you're required to reply to a customer concern. So that ecosystem has dramatically matured. There are some great tools out there, also something that we can help with.
And we're hoping that the response becomes somewhat standardized, right? Anybody that's lived through an audit before knows that, the 2 weeks before an audit are basically downtime as you prep. With these kind of solutions, when you know the audit's coming, hopefully it's just a press button, give me the full report. And hopefully they become somewhat standardized in the assessment program process as well, in that that's what the assessors expect to see when they show up, right? They've already seen it, they're familiar with it, and they know how to read it. And there's not a lot of extra work involved just to respond to the assessment, right? The real work there should be making sure your network and your data is secure, not prepping for the assessment, right? Hopefully you've already done that with the artifacts.
I think we've got one more here to speak to, Craig, that probably falls well under your remit, asking if CMMC applies only to DoD contracts or other government contracts as well.
Indeed. The technical answer, the correct answer is the CMMC solely applies only to DoD and contracts doing business with the DoD. What is of interest, and we probably should all take note, right? After we did, and I spoke about this earlier, right? After you went through the process to become 800-171 compliant, now we switched to CMMC. I just did all that work. Hopefully it's built upon the same framework, and fortunately it is, so all that good work doesn't go to waste. The CMMC is only specific to the DoD right now. You only see that in DoD contracts. However, over the summer, there was a interagency cybersecurity group that met, the Solarian Commission, that met to discuss, the government's cybersecurity plans moving forward. And they did discuss and look at adopting a very similar process to CMMC, right? So even as you move past as a company doing business just with the DoD, if you have the CMMC process completed, if you're compliant with it, if you're already at a certain level, it is likely that the doing business with other parts of the government will fall in line pretty easily. Nothing's official yet, but that's what's expected. So
right. So they have discussed adopting that framework for other parts of the federal government, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think it's also worth pointing out, we mentioned it a number of times. This is a moving picture at the moment. Just in the last couple of weeks, there are board members on the CMMCAB leaving and new board members appointed, and some rules changing and some guidance being published. And they're talking about, assessors will now potentially have to be ISO certified as well. So that there's a significant amount of movement. I think it helps to stay close to it, certainly if you're going to be impacted. And again, feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to answer your questions. And just in closing, I'd really like to thank our partners at Allergen for facilitating this. If anybody in the audience, certainly if there's anything you need some help with, feel free to reach out to us directly or to Allergen, and we'll do what we can to help you out. Craig, thanks for your time, my friend. Good session.
Thank you. Good speak as always. Enjoy, and thank you everyone for your time.
All right. Thanks, folks.